And good Wednesday evening. And thank you all for giving us your time and for your interest. My name is Tom McNamara with Arizona Public Media, and you've joined us for Fire on the Mountain, Understanding Tucson's Bighorn Fire. This is the first of a series of 3 forums we will hold like this, examining the event itself and the causes and aftermath and the future of Catalina Mountain and our general vicinity here. I want to thank you, and there are a lot of folks involved in this who want to thank you. Everyone at the Arizona Institute for Resilience, the Desert Laboratory on Tumamoc Hill, Arizona Public Media, and of course, all of our panelists and partners, a lot of folks behind the scenes who've put together a wonderful program for you tonight. First among them is Dr. Ben Wilder, who is the director of the Desert Laboratory on Tumamoc Hill, who would like to say a few words and welcome you, Ben.
Thanks a lot. Hello, everybody. Welcome. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And the inspiration behind tonight's episode and this series in general is the Bighorn Fire was such a watershed event for our community. I know myself, like many, if not all of you, watched as the fire began in early June and just kind of continued to roll through the Catalinas, coming down to the foothills and then just progressing further and further east. And so many questions came up during that. And as well, I mean, it was a very emotional period too, for those people that were evacuated, for those that some of your favorite spots, places of refuge, hiking spots are on the mountains and unclear of their fate. And so many questions are kind of just in my mind, and I imagine so many of yours. And so one of the things though is that is so much expertise at hand within our community throughout the University of Arizona and at Keystone Nonprofits and with the Forest Service. So we really want to bring those voices to you. Having science and knowledge be relevant and timely has never been more important. And that is really the underpinning of this series and all of the voices, the diverse voices you're going to be hearing tonight and in the next 2 episodes in the next 2 weeks. As Tom said, there's been a lot of fantastic people working behind the scenes to bring you this. And we're just really excited that you were able to join us. And I'm, for one, really looking forward to hearing the perspectives over the next coming hour and a half and then the next 2 weeks. So thanks a lot for joining us.
All right. Ben, thank you very much. And I was leaning forward a moment ago to check the numbers. We're about to eclipse the 1,000 mark. We had about 1,700 participants sign up for this forum this evening. So we are grateful to each and every one of you for joining us. I would like to introduce Dr. Betsy Cantwell, Senior Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Arizona, who is also involved in our project. Doctor?
Thank you so much, Tom. And I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the University of Arizona, and particularly say thanks to Ben and the Desert Laboratory on Tumamoc Hill team. This is, in my opinion, what the University of Arizona is for in our community. We have the capacity to bring all of these wide variety of disciplines together around seminal topics like this. And I want to point out that the Arizona Institute for Resilience is a relatively new institute, and the idea of resilience, which is really where we need to go with climate change and with environmental matters, as well as all of the, and now we know, all of the kinds of resilience that we need to show during a time of pandemic or any other major issues, is what we're here for. I am looking at the numbers. We're well over 1,000. My little ticker doesn't count over 1,000. So let me also thank all of our panelists. It's a little bit late in the day. You've probably been Zooming all day, and if you're like me, hopefully this Zoom will be reinvigorating and not just another Zoom. I think for our community, it's huge. And I really also want to call out Sarah Smallhouse. Thank you, Sarah, for sponsoring this. This is incredibly meaningful, the first of many, I hope, I want to end by just pointing out that our commitment to the community embodied in the Institute for Resilience is really meant to help all of you think about all of the matters that are going to accelerate in their importance for us, and focusing first and foremost on this major conflagration. I've lived through 3 major fires, not in the Arizona region, and each one has changed my life and burned down my homes. And I mean, these things become, whether you are in the middle of the fire or not, they are pointers to us for things we need to pay attention to. And I think this panel is a remarkable panel for helping us see that. Thank you, Tom.
Betsy,
Welcome,
thank
everyone.
you. Thank you. And as you and Ben mentioned now, this one hit close to home, very close to home. And it certainly affected us through the month of June into July. And it's going to affect us for many, many years to come. And that's why we're here now to discuss a lot of aspects of the fire. By now, you know the numbers. It burned over 120,000 acres in the Catalina Mountains and changed our landscape for decades to come. So we have a lot of questions about what happened and what happens now, what the future holds. During these 3 webinars, we'll look at why did the fire get so large? I think it faked out a lot of us thinking this will be done in a few days. And of course, that didn't happen. What about the role of climate change and drought in the bigger picture? We'll be talking about that some. How was wildlife impacted in the fire? A lot of concerns about the animals and what happened to them and what will happen going forward in their habitats that have now been altered by the fire and the aftermath. What role did invasive species have in the extent of the fire at lower elevations, the buffle grass and things like that to talk about? Before we start, a few tips for everyone on Zoom now. We'll ask you to please use the Q&A button at the bottom to submit a question for the panelists. We'll be taking questions. We'll be getting to those a little bit later on at the end of the episodes. And we'll try to choose a nice cross-section of questions to cover a lot of ground. We are being recorded now, and this will be posted in about a day on the Arizona Institutes for Resilience website. So please know that. And we'll get to our first guest now, our first panelist, to talk more about the fire. Dr. Molly Hunter, Associate Professor, a Research Professor at the University of Arizona School of Natural Resources and the Environment. Molly is also the primary science advisor for the Joint Fire Science Program. She serves as research manager for the Southwest Climate Science Adaptation Science Center and works as public information officer on wildfire incidents like this, including the Bighorn Fire. Molly, welcome, and we'll ask you to begin by giving us sort of a quick overview of our beloved Catalina Mountains.
Sure. Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. And I also want to thank all the sponsors of this webinar and for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you all this evening. Yeah, so as you mentioned, Catalina Mountains are very special in this region for a number of different reasons. They're one of what many in southern Arizona that we call Sky Island, and they're called this because they're this sort of isolated mountain range that's surrounded by desert that quite dramatically juts up to several thousand feet. And that means, as anyone who's driven up Catalina Highway knows, in a short amount of time, you could see several different vegetation zones, starting in Sonoran Desert, going into grassland and oak woodlands, and then all the way up into conifer forest. So very diverse. Also very diverse because of their geography. They sort of sit where the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico meet. They also kind of sit right where the Sonoran Desert and the Chihuahuan Desert meet. So, just with that geography, they have this unique mix of plants and animals that you just don't find really anywhere else. And so for that reason, they're very important for biodiversity. But also, as you mentioned, they're just a very special place for all of us in the region. Very culturally significant for Native Americans, very important for the tourism sector of our economy, regionally. And also just, I think all of us have stories about how special this place is, you know, from hiking and picnics in Sabino Canyon to, you know, day trips or camping trips at Mount Lemmon. My kids had their first camping trip on Mount Lemmon. So all of us have that real personal connection to this mountain range, I think.
And Molly, how, you know, the big question, the nagging question, if you will, is how did this fire get so big? A lot of people were startled by that, and the fact that it took this zigzag, awkward, crazy path for days and days, crazy to us anyway, watching it. How did that all happen?
Well, so I think some of the speakers tonight can probably address that in a little bit more detail, but I'll give you a couple reasons. One is where it started. So it started on Push Ridge on June 5th, and it started in that grassland fuel type. And that fuel type in particular, fire can spread extremely rapidly. So within an hour, you can get a fire that's up to 2,000 to 3,000 acres in size. And that's, you know, without much strong winds. So, you know, when it's spreading at that rate, it's really spreading faster than the rate at which firefighters can get in there and build containment lines. So that's one reason. Another is just the fact that it started in early June. You know, June, is most people know, is typically our driest and hottest month. So it had several weeks to spread before the area would see any measurable rainfall. So that was another critical factor, just kind of where it started, the types of fuels it started in, and the time that it started. Before I get another question, there is one point about kind of the size that I want to make that I hope the viewers will kind of keep in mind throughout this series, and that is, you know, my training is in fire ecology, and when I'm trying to think about what the impacts of a fire are going to be, usually the size of the fire is not a metric that I care so much about. And the reason for that is that, you know, fire is a natural part of ecosystems. It's a necessary part of ecosystems. But at the same time, we all know fire can have really detrimental ecological and human effects. So when I'm trying to gauge, you know, whether or not a fire is good or bad, I'm thinking about where did it spread? You know, did it spread in habitats that are really sensitive to fire? And I also think about how hot it burned. Generally speaking, the hotter the fire, the more severe the effects are going to be. So those are kind of the metrics that I think other speakers will talk about when they're talking about what are the long-term implications of the fire going to be. They're looking at where it's burned and how hot it got.
And you mentioned before, you know, like forest fires, they say they do some good. You know, it's nature's way of keeping things regenerating and healthy. What report card would you give the aftermath of this fire as far as the impact ecologically to our beloved Catalina Mountains?
So some of that, it takes many months and even years of assessment to really get an accurate report card of what the fire did to the mountain. We have to have some time for vegetation to grow back and kind of understand exactly where it burned and how it burned in the places that it did. But I can say that this fire and the Aspen Fire and all of these fires, they do tend to result in what we call a mosaic of effects. So if you, I'm sure at some point during this presentation, you'll see what we call a severity map that kind of shows the different parts of the fire that burned hot, the different parts that burned with low and moderate intensity. And it's very common on fires of this size to see a real mosaic of effects. So there's some areas that burned really hot, others that burned not so hot. So we'll see both beneficial effects from this fire and some detrimental effects for sure.
So each fire leaves its own imprint, that mosaic you mentioned. How else does this fire differ from fires of the past? For example, the Aspen Fire back in '03.
Yeah, so like I said, that both of those fires kind of resulted in this sort of mosaic effect. And so this is what you're seeing now is kind of that map of the different categories of fire severity, with the red being the hottest part of the fire. I think another similarity with these fires was sort of the progression pattern. So they both started sort of in that southwestern part of the range and spread to the north and northeast. And that's really driven by our characteristic wind patterns, and in this time of year, a lot of our winds come out of the southwest, and that's what's going to drive that progression pattern. But I think one, really important difference between the Aspen Fire and the Bighorn Fire was the human toll. So on the Bighorn Fire, even though you had multiple evacuations all around this fire, and one estimate, there's 81 miles of urban interface that was at some point impacted by the fire. In the end, there were no structures lost, which is, a testament to the incredible work of all the firefighters and the incident management teams that were called to the fire. And that, of course, is different from the Aspen Fire, where tragically there were a number of structures lost up on Mount Lemmon. And that is, of course, a testament to those firefighters and those teams. But I think another thing that we have to acknowledge is that since the Aspen Fire, there's been a lot of work done by communities like Summerhaven and Oracle, and their cooperation with the Forest Service. Lots of things like thinning and prescribed fire, and just the community is doing a lot of work to make sure they're cleaning up debris and being fire wise. And all that work is really critical. It allows firefighters to better defend those communities once the inevitable next fire comes along.
Molly, between these efforts you mentioned over the years, especially since the Aspen Fire, to mitigate the fire danger through thinning and other methods, and the fact that a large part of the Catalinas just burned, is it safe to say, is it fair to say that our fire danger has been lessened now due to everything having been burned out at this point?
Well, it will, yes, it's be lessened for some time, but remember, even the Aspen Fire was not that long ago, right? About 17 years ago. And so and I think a lot of people sort of have the impression that once an area burns, it's not going to burn again. But over time, vegetation is going to grow, fuels are going to accumulate, and so that fire threat is going to come back.
And you mentioned before briefly that the Catalinas are such a draw for this area, especially for visitors, but just the beauty of this area, the lure. It's going to take many years to really assess the ecological impact on a scientific level, but do you think any damage has been done as far as diminishing that lure or harming the essence of these mountains that would be tangible to people who might want to visit and take it all in?
Well, I think the areas that people are used to going to, like Sabino Canyon, or driving up Mount Lemmon and seeing trees and being able to go on hiking trails and all of those things, you're still going to be able to do that when the forest opens up again, for sure.
Good to hear. That's very calming for a lot of folks and soothing, Molly. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your input. And I'll ask you to stay around. I know we're going to be having some questions later on after the panel is finished. But yeah, great thoughts and wonderful input. And thank you so much for your time and your involvement here. I want to welcome at this point Dr. Kim Franklin, who is a conservation science manager at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. One of her areas of expertise is the invasive species Buffle Grass and its impacts on the Sonoran Desert, and as the lead on the Save Our Saguaros campaign. And Dr. Franklin, welcome. Thank you for your time and your involvement and your thoughts. Before we talk about the Buffle Grass, before we talk about the saguaro, one of the most dramatic aspects of this fire was the dropping down the slope like it did on the edge of the Catalinas, resulting in evacuations and damage, to many saguaros, etc. What exactly allowed the fire to fuel and slide down that mountain like it did?
Well, thank you for having me, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to talk about this issue. That question, what allowed the fire to drop down into the desert in the locations where it did, is a question that colleagues and I are hoping to be able to answer in the coming months, when it's safe to get back on the forest, get on the ground, and examine the fire perimeter and find out what sort of behavior took place along that perimeter. We do know that the fire did drop down into several locations, and one of the things we're most interested in is whether this grass that you see right here, buffle grass, played a role in that. So before the arrival of buffle grass and other invasive grasses, our desert habitat at the base of the mountain essentially was a natural fire break. There's just not enough fuel within the desert habitat to sustain a significant fire. But many invasive grasses are here now, and one in particular, buffle grass, has become, I would say, alarmingly abundant, and it loves fire. It burns hot, it burns fast. It's a fire-loving grass that's native to the savannas of Africa. And so in the other images there, you could see buffle grass. It's sort of this disheveled looking bunch grass. And here in the Sonoran Desert, we are in the Tucson Basin at ground zero of this invasion. The Catalinas and the Rincon Mountains are ground zero of the buffle grass invasion. So we don't know at this point how big of a role buffle grass or other invasive grasses played, but we are hoping to find out soon.
Kim, does that buffle grass regenerate? In other words, when you have a forest fire, it burns out a lot of dead wood, if you will, thins the forest, helps it regenerate in the years to come. When this buffle grass burns, is that the end of it, or is it tough? Does it regenerate anyway in spite of a devastating fire?
Yeah, buffle grass is an incredibly tough grass. It's really actually an impressive grass. It is, if you think about the savannas of Africa, those are ecosystems that evolved with frequent fire, with drought, with heavy grazing. And so buffle grass is really just a remarkably resilient grass. It actually thrives on fire. So after a fire, it's going to come back even more lush than it was before. And that's in striking contrast to our native plants, which actually are not adapted to fire. And so when fire moves through a buffle grass patch, what's going to come back is buffle grass, and most of the natives won't be able to regenerate.
You know, much like kudzu has overrun the South, is buffle grass manageable, controllable, even in a certain geographic contained area, or will we always be fighting an uphill battle with this?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that buffle grass is here to stay. We're not going to eradicate buffle grass from the Sonoran Desert, but we can control it. We know how to control it. There's a great example that shows that we can control it. I'd like to highlight the work of the Sonoran Desert Weed Whackers. It's a group of volunteers that work under Doug Siegel. He's with Pima County. They've been digging up buffle grass for the past 20 years. It's a small group of volunteers, and they are who we have to thank when you drive over Gates Pass and you see the stunning views of some of the densest stands of saguaros in the world. The reason that that area is not covered in buffle grass is because volunteers have just maintained that area free of it.
Kim, we'd like to get your thoughts on this. Everyone's thinking of the images we all saw in the news, the burned saguaros, the slurry dropping from the sky. You know, you don't want to think of our beloved desert burning, but what has changed and what is happening that even perhaps helped to allow this fire to go as long and as far as it did?
Yeah, so I can only speak to the fire at the lower elevations in the desert habitat. And so before I talk about the images on the screen right now of burning saguaros, I just want to state that even without fire, with or without fire, buffle grass is transforming the desert. It's transforming a richly biodiverse desert into a grassland, a buffle grass grassland. And buffle grass outcompetes our native plants with or without fire. The images that you're seeing there are from a very recent fire in the Catalina foothills. It was just last August, so almost exactly 1 year ago. There was a fire called the Mercer Fire, and it was 25 acres, a buffle grass patch. And those are images that were taken just shortly after the fire. You can see the ground is still black, and then a little bit later when buffle grass has returned. So with fire, that transformation from desert to grassland is happening even faster. And that's why buffle grass is a particularly worrisome invasive species. There's many invasive species, but not many with the power to transform one ecosystem to another.
It breaks your heart to see those photos of the burned saguaros and to know that, you know, Buffle Grass was a contributor to the devastation that we saw over the past month and a half. Dr. Franklin, thank you for your thoughts, and we'll ask you to stand by for questions in just a little while.
Thank you.
Appreciate your input, and thank you. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Laura Marshall, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Arizona School of Natural Resources and Environment, and the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, well known at the U, where she specializes in forest ecology and resilience, with an interest in the intersection of past disturbances and climate as a driver of community change, if you will. Dr. Marshall, thank you. We'll ask you to start off by giving us a bit of an overview of the natural fire cycles in the Catalinas.
Great, thank you, Tom, and thank you for having me. Now, I've had a great introduction to what's going on down in the low desert, so I'm going to focus higher up the mountain. As we know, as you drive up the mountain, you go through many different vegetation types, and they all have their own particular fire regime. And that's the pattern, the frequency, and the severity of fire historically. In ponderosa pine, as you see here, you'd expect frequent fire, but burning at a low intensity, burning through the understory, burning up some seedlings, but usually the large trees will survive. Now, if you remove that frequent fire, the seedlings grow in and they fill in the forest and really build up that fuel load. So when you get fire returning to that forest, as we know always will, it'll get higher into the trees, it'll burn up more large trees, and in extreme cases, when the wind is driving the fire, you can end up with a crown fire that consumes basically everything, burning all the trees. And that's pretty hard to recover from for ponderosa. So we know the specific fire history in the Catalinas from tree ring research. So dendrochronology, if you sample a scarred tree, which large ponderosa pine will do, when you have a low severity fire come through, it'll burn some of the trunks a little bit, but the tree will survive and recover. And then the next fire that comes through, it'll burn it again. And you get these curls build up. And if you sample them, that curl will point right at a specific ring year. And if you combine that, looking across multiple trees at multiple sites, you get something that looks like this. It's a composite fire chronology. So each horizontal line is a site with a few trees, and each vertical black line is a fire on that site. So where there's a thick black line across the entire page there, that's a spreading low intensity fire that happened in the past. And what's especially notable about this is that we had really frequent fire through much of the past, the 1500s, the 1900s, and it just stopped. And that's due to human influence, land use change, and then active suppression. We wanted to put out all the fires to save our forest resources, but in a frequent fire system like ponderosa, that has unintended side effects of building up that fuel load. So when the fire does come back, you get these large, severe fires like we've seen recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Marshall, in your fire forensic laboratory, if you will, tell us about the dynamics of this particular fire and how it interacts with previous fires like the Aspen Fire, obviously.
Right, so we can know that by looking at the past burn history. And really, I think the Bighorn Fire is especially notable because it's the second time this entire mountain range has burned basically in the past 20 years. Which is approaching that 10-year historic interval. So it's almost natural in that way that you'd expect widespread fire across a mountain range. But because of that fuel buildup from that lack of fire in the 1900s, you had much greater fire effects than you might have seen otherwise, even with repeat fire. We do know from other large incidents that when a fire burns into an area that's burned previously, it'll generally calm down and be less of an impact. And that also depends on the fuels present on the site and the weather and the topography. And those were particular factors in the Bighorn. If we're going to go to my slides, I have a few that show these factors in particular. So basically, I'm going to look at the area specifically around Summerhaven, south of Radio Ridge compared to north. And that area north of Radio Ridge was where the fire really blew up on June 17th. This is looking south into the wilderness of rocks after the Aspen Fire. We know the Aspen Fire burned very hot, very severe through this area, but you can tell because you have all those dead trees sticking up. Of course, some trees did survive in that area, and you had a really great growth of the understory, which you can see all through the base there. And the next slide. So here's a fire progression map, as you saw earlier. You can compare where that big push up the mountain was on June 17th. And in the weeks or so later, it kind of moved across below the radio ridge. And really noticeable is on that big day, basically, that's the day when you had the most high severity impacts from the fire. The next slide. So that's all that red patch pretty much happened in one day. It's not quite as alarming as it might look, because a lot of that area was oak woodland, and it was oak woodland even before the Aspen Fire, which also burned hot through there, which you'd expect for oak. But below Radio Ridge, you can see it's more low to moderate, some patchy high severity. Yeah, we can move forward. But really, if you look, so this is a kind of tricky graph. It's comparing fire severity in the prior fire, so the Aspen or Bullock Fire, and then the Bighorn Fire. And you can see basically that pink patches above the road are the high severity areas that also were mostly high severity in Aspen. And the darker pinks are areas where that high severity is kind of pushing out, possibly expanding that area of high impact. But compared to the kind of lighter blue and lighter yellow areas were areas that burn low and moderate in the Bighorn Fire, but had previously burned at higher severity. So you see some effects of the previous kind of loss of fuels basically resulted in likely lower impacts this time, but some areas just were pretty severely burned. And of course, we won't know for certain until we get up there and put in some plots and do some more research, which hopefully will happen at some point in the near future.
So Doctor, we've seen how your research in Sky Island Mountain Range looks at this intersection of past disturbances and climate as like a driver of community change, if you will. Help us understand what this means on the ground, especially as it relates to the Bighorn Fire. What are the three scenarios I know you talk about of plant community change that we can expect going forward now?
Right, so after severe fire, there's a few different things that need to happen for ecosystem recovery to occur, and really whether it'll occur at all. So if you have a large area and you lose all the trees, that's kind of hard. And what can come back really depends on species traits. If you have oak or aspen on that site where it burned hot, could be just fine because they sprout from the roots pretty soon right after fire. But pines mostly need seeding. So you need a seed tree somewhere nearby that survived to get those pines back. Now this is an area that was just oak after the Aspen Fire, and probably those areas north of the highway that burned really severely are going to be a lot more oak. And one thing that we know will happen there is the oak will outcompete seedlings, especially when you have a kind of hotter, drier, droughty condition. And that kind of leads to conversion of like pine oak woodland into just oak. Now you can also just get grass after a fire. This is from the High Park Fire in Colorado, where they had a big wind-driven event like we saw on June 17th. But they had 20,000 acres basically lose all trees and just grass is left. And to get trees back into that patch will either require heavy restoration or something else. And in the Catalinas in particular, I think you can expect areas with the forest less dense, as we've had a few major fires kind of clearing out that fuel accumulation, more oak in some areas. And really the tree recovery in the severely burned areas depends on having weather that's good for seedlings. Seedlings need kind of a wetter, moisture environment to really establish, and that's kind of hard, these days to get. But one thing we do know for sure is that the fires burned very frequently in the past, and as we know, nothing's stopping them from burning again in the future. So expect this again in 10 years, maybe.
Doctor, you mentioned before, you as a scientist, like many scientists, including our panelists, are anxious to get up there and do your thing and do the research in the aftermath of the fire. How soon will that effort get underway, and how long does it take to get a handle on what happened as it relates to your field of expertise?
Right. Well, I'm involved with a few folks in SNRE, Don Falk and Craig Rasmussen, that are putting together a research proposal to track hydrologic and ecological effects of the fire, especially around Green Mountain. And that kind of research agreement is getting through the Forest Service, protocols right now. So hopefully in weeks to months, we'll be able to get up there and establish plots, because really time is of the essence to get the really immediate effects of the fire. You want to get up there as soon as you can.
What is your biggest concern as you approach this monumental task?
Oh,
First, what you might expect to find.
let's see. Really, I think the potential for future establishment of seedlings is really a great concern in the severely burned areas. So if we continue to have drought for the next 5-10 years, you could set up all the plots you want and seedlings just won't grow. So it would be kind of sad to have a big project potentially tracking recovery and not have that.
Yeah. Well, we're hoping for the best, Doctor, and then when you finally get after it, we're hoping that everyone finds some silver linings and solutions that will heal us sooner than later and heal the mountain. Thank you so much for your thoughts and your time. And again, we'll ask you to stay with us, and we'll be having a question and answer period in just a little while. But thank you again for your time, Doctor. Good to talk with you. Time to welcome a couple of guests from the Coronado National Forest. We have District Ranger CJ Woodard, I'm trying to say. CJ's here along with Stephen Miranda, who is the Fire and Aviation Staff Officer. Thank you both for joining us. And I'll toss the question out there. What was it like fighting this fire compared to other fires you've been involved with?
Hey, Tom, and thanks for having us. So, well, I would like to talk about first how, a comparison. Let's do a comparison of this one to the Aspen. And so, looking back on the Aspen, that fire was a human-caused fire, Bighorn lightning caused. Looking at the structures that were destroyed on the Aspen Fire, we had 322 residents destroyed, 7 commercial properties and 4 outbuildings. On the Bighorn, 2 outbuildings were damaged. And that's a real attribute to the hard work of the men and women firefighters that were on the ground and in the air. And in particular, that day on June 17th, on top of the mountain there at Summerhaven, I was up there because we knew that that day was going to be a pretty significant day where the fire was positioned, and where the fire was positioned and the weather that was forecasted. We knew that there was a potential for trouble, but the firefighters put up a valiant effort. They had prepared diligently and were able to save all the homes up there and the businesses. So which I think was just an astounding bit of work. So, and I'd also like to talk about some of the stuff that was done prior to the Bighorn even burning. The community of Summerhaven, the state of Arizona and the Forest Service had partnered up in order to do some really good fuels reduction work in there. And I wholeheartedly feel that that work in there played an important role in saving all those structures. I'd also like to talk about the percent of area that was classified as high burn severity. So we had done an assessment for the Aspen Fire. And at that point, the Aspen Fire had burned in high severity at 17% of the area of the fire. Our assessment now, using remote sensing and then field verification, we're showing a high burn severity of only 4% of the fire. And that really talks to the techniques that the ground firefighters and the aerial firefighters are using to apply low intensity burning on the landscape. And it's so important, so firefighters will walk fire down along a ridge line, slowly burn that fire at a cooler temperature, less BTUs, so we can maintain that important cover vegetation, maintain the important ponderosa pines in the mountain, and then just to prepare for, after the fire in the case of heavy rains and flooding, so that we do have some vegetation left behind. Previously, years ago when I first started, that was not really thought about. Now it's a huge consideration that we maintain that that valuable resource on our mountains. Another thing I'd like to mention is that we have the fire had burned through the old Aspen scar, and a lot of that dead and down woody debris burned up in that. So that is also going to be beneficial for future fires, so, because those heavy fuels can be very troublesome for us. And now that has now been mitigated. Something that we do different now, and I think it's important for the Santa Catalina Mountains, is we use a different aerial retardant, the red slurry that you see coming out of aircraft on the mountains. So it plays two roles. So yes, it's a fire suppressant, but secondarily, it's designed so that that red residue will diminish after we receive some rains. And we're still hoping for some more monsoon moisture so we can get the rest of that red paint off the side of that mountain. But I think it's important because we want to maintain those visual qualities of the Santa Catalina Mountains. And that's important to us from the Coronado National Forest. So that's why we've moved into using that fugitive retardant. Now talking about the Aspen Fire, and you know, the Aspen Fire, we try to do direct suppression strategy. Firefighters just consistently moving up the line, right on the fire's edge. And it was the same for the Bullock. I was on the Bullock as a hotshot crew member. And what we found out over time is in that terrain and that particular fuels, it's almost an attempt in futility, because we get the high temperatures, the winds, we lose the line, and you're back to square one. So this time we utilized a combination of direct and indirect fire line construction, which gave us a higher probability of success. And that was the best decision in order to protect natural, cultural, and structural values.
Yeah, Stephen, you talked general strategy. Tell us a little bit more about the strategy, and throw it out for you or CJ. What were with this fire, the main challenges and the main successes you had?
Sure, some of the main challenges and successes, I would say, I think what we struggled with, you know, our initial strategy on this fire was to take a very aggressive approach. We ordered heavy aircraft. We ordered air tankers initially. We had helicopters, 4 heavy helicopters on it. We were going very aggressive with this because we did not want a large fire on the mountain. And, you know, some of the struggles that we had come up with is, you know, in the era of COVID, it changes the way we fight fire dramatically. It changes the way we feed firefighters, where we bed them down, where they go to get their briefings. It's very challenging. So, you know, we had implemented a modulus 1 policy so that we could have firefighters contained to their own particular unit, so that there was no spreading of the virus if somebody was potentially infected. Mm-hmm. Other issues we came across, drones. Drones were a real issue. We had a number of intrusions on the Bighorn Fire, and unfortunately, a couple of those intrusions from public using drones in our airspace under the temporary flight airspace, shutting down the air show. Mm-hmm. And that air show goes away, and it makes it more challenging for the firefighters to be successful on the ground. They need that water backed up with their line construction. So that was a real challenge. And then, you know, finally, the struggle included the environmental side. You know, in May, June, July, that was the hottest May, June, and July on record. You know, and that also affects aircraft, the way they operate, the density, altitude. They cannot carry as much water. And on top of that, as you know, the hotter it gets, the faster fires move, but the slower firefighters move as well. So it's kind of that. Yeah, kind of.
You had those challenges with COVID and everything else this year in the heat. And I'll ask you to stand by too for some questions a little bit later on, and bring in CJ Woodard to talk a little bit more about the points you're making, the strategy and the techniques. And CJ, what was new with technology, equipment, and the way you approach this fire? Especially since the Aspen Fire. Now, we know that your field evolves all the time. So tell us what was different this time.
Hey, Tom, thanks for that question, and thanks to everybody for joining us. I do want to say, you know, we did have a lot of advances in technology since the Aspen Fire, and I'll just hone in on 3 of those, and a couple of those are, well, one is drones, the other one is Arcgis Collector, and another is our risk management assistance program that we have here, and then those virtual meetings. So what you're looking at on the screen right now is a fixed wing, 16-foot, what we call a Type 1 drone. In firefighting, you know, it ranges from type 1 to type 5, type 1 being the highest complexity, type 5 being the lowest, and that's how we rank our aircraft as well. And so that type 1 drone is fully equipped with infrared technology. So when you all see those, the infrared flights and the mapping that we have, those get ordered up, and that plane surveys tons of fires throughout the GAC, the geographic area. And so those flights could happen at 8 o'clock at night, 2 o'clock in the morning. So what this drone does for us is it allows for real-time information through Zoom. So it's streamed to the IC and some of the ops through Zoom while they're flying earlier in the morning. So when they fly at 4 a.m. in the morning, the ops chief and Zoom in the IC can take a look at that information and get real-time data. Also with that type 1 drone, it's available to, it can be controlled from up to 55 miles away, has 15 hours of flight time, and can fly well above the TFR, you know, about 13,000 feet above all of the aircraft that are working the fire, so it can kind of stay out of the way as well. That's what makes that drone different from any of the drones. And that drone is also under the control of the aviation officer who is assigned to the fire. So that drone can also do some 3D mapping, has 3D mapping capabilities, some high resolution photography capabilities, and can do some surveys for us as well. But also we have type 3 aircraft, which is a smaller aircraft drone that we use. And we use that on this fire to do some precision firing using plastic spears on the fire to strategically fire off some sections of the line that we wanted to use, that we wanted to hold. You know, additionally, I talked about Arcgis Collector. Collector is a platform that allows for real-time mapping of things like drop points, control lines, dip sites, and hazards. And it was integral to us performing some speedy recoveries of some of our lines and some of our, doing some of our suppression repair. So a lot of people saw that going on later in the fire, where you see resources riding around. You might have seen some heavy equipment going around. They were able to do that suppression repair very quickly and update those maps and keep the public apprised of what work was going on the ground. One final thing that was really good for us that is different from the Aspen fires, we now have risk management assistants, and what that is a team of highly trained incident commanders, but then also agency administrators. And so agency administrators are people like myself who are there to admin the fire. You know, one of my trainers was always told me, you're not an agency operator, you're an agency administrator. So you're here to administer the fire, make sure everything's going smoothly, and we're using the public dollars appropriately. So we have those advanced people there to help us out and provide enhanced fire analytics to improve fire management responses through a risk informed process. So we are as agency administrators and ICs, we are tasked with making risk-based prudent decisions. And so we do use that risk management analysis process to do that. And some of the products that they provide are trade-off analysis, and then some in-person or virtual risk management exercises to bring agency administrators and ICs out of the midst of the dogfight and kind of look at it from a 50,000 foot level to make sure that we're making the appropriate decisions and making decisions commensurate with those values at risk on the ground. Yeah. And then also they produce a suppressing difficulty index, and then also some potential control locations for us that were used on this fire as well. You know, that's one of the reasons we had a big success with this fire and using those Aspen Fire control lines on the north end towards Oracle, and having that knowledge and then also having that information from ARMA allowed us to be very successful.
Yeah, familiar territory. CJ, everyone knows nothing replaces a good wildland firefighter, but is it safe to say that all this technology you're speaking of actually helped to reduce the size of the fire and the time it took to put it out 100% contained? Was it tangibly effective?
I would say it was tangibly effective. Those, you know, that information that we get from ARMA letting us know where we have the best chances to be successful without putting firefighters at extreme risk. And this is extremely complex terrain here. And I'm looking out my window of my house because I'm looking at the Santa Catalinas. This is extremely complex terrain that we have here to fight fire in. As you can tell, when fires do get started and they get established, they are very hard to catch if everything gets aligned. And so some of the strategies that were put in place based on what Steve was just talking to you about, but also those PCLs or potential control locations that were provided to us, aided in these firefighters being successful and also suppressing this fire.
Well, CJ, we want to thank you. A lot of people are grateful to you and Stephen and the 1,000+ firefighters who literally came to the rescue, especially with that Type 1 team that you've spoken of. You know, when the fire gets really big and really hot, here comes Type 1, and those guys, you know, don't take any prisoners. So thank you for your information and your efforts, as well as Stephen. We'll keep you on hold for a few moments while we get through our next panelist, and then we'll stir up some questions for you and appreciate what you've done and what you do. Thank you very much. I will move on to our next panelist now. Everyone wants to talk to the weatherman, especially this time of year, and Jeremy Michael is a meteorologist. He's with the National Weather Service in Tucson. He's an air resources advisor. He's affiliated with the Forest Service. That's how he ties in here. And he's one of about 80 incident meteorologists in the country who are deployed to wildfires like this and natural disasters. And Jeremy is only now getting back to normal. He worked multiple shifts on the Bighorn Fire, worked very hard. And we appreciate all that Jeremy did in his role fighting that fire. Jeremy, welcome. And let me start out by asking you, we've heard about how hot the weather was, how dry we were when the lightning struck in early June and throughout the month into July. What were the climactic and weather conditions that converged to create the perfect storm to feed this wildfire, the Bighorn Fire?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks, Tom, for the nice introduction. Happy to be here and the opportunity to speak, especially discussing the weather and the climate that really impacted and drove this fire. So it's kind of a fascinating fire with regards to, because usually you think massive drought, destructive fires, but in this case, we didn't have a drought currently in place across southern Arizona when this fire started. We just had what was considered abnormally dry, but what we are now seeing is the beginning of a possible drought. And so what was fascinating is what some of the panelists have said earlier is, you know, the abundance of fine fuel and grasses and vegetation. And some of these charts here that are going through are showing the past 30 years of the spring time frames. And here, October 1st to May 31st is some of our winter seasons, winter rains. And you can really see in 2019, 2020 on the tail end of that to the right, the wettest period of time in the past maybe 10, 15, 20 years. And that really allowed an abundance of fine fuel to grow. And when you have all this increase in vegetation, and as some of the panelists said, you know, steep rocky terrain, and then you add in the topography, the weather, we had some pretty significant weather events that drove this fire. We had several red flag warnings that to meet a red flag warning criteria, you need low relative humidity and strong gusty winds, which you can see here on this image right now. And we had several of those days. And when you have these fuel types and you have these fires and you have the alignments of the wind with, you know, a lot of the winds that we had were out of the southwest and south, that can cause a fire to move several miles in a day. And here's a weather instrument from atop Mount Lemmon up at Ski Valley. Now it's kind of more of an extreme wind reading because this is it's fully exposed and sits on a higher elevation, but it's a really good indication of just how strong the winds were and what the firefighters had to battle with this fire. You could see it in these graphs here. In the middle one, the blue line is sustained wind speeds, and then that orange line is wind gusts. We actually had wind gusts on these red flag warning days, June 17th, June 28th, June 29th, of sustained winds 30 to 40 miles per hour, gusts 50 to 60 miles per hour. Now, they weren't that strong everywhere on the fire. You know, some of the ridges protect the certain locations from those stronger winds. The valley locations may not see, but it's still a good representation of just how abnormal and how unusual these wind events were, and how late in the year and month that they occurred. Usually we don't see wind events like this. These are more of our spring events. And when we had some of those big days, the next couple of pictures here shows what you can see. And that smoke, that was from San Manuel, and that was pushing significant smoke well off to the northeast, and in fact, all the way into the central plains of the United States.
Jeremy, you mentioned before you go back 10, 20, 30 years, meteorologists do a lot of historical comparisons. How far back do you go, and do you see these conditions come together, this confluence in June, every 20, 30 years or so? Is it part of a longer, broader pattern, or could it be part of more modern changes in weather patterns and temperatures and all that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's always, one of the things we're dealing with, we certainly have climate change. That's a factor. There are some more obvious reasons to what we are seeing and why we are seeing things, but there may be things that it might take a long time to learn what the full impacts are from climate change. There's been some recent research that suggests that the monsoon, on average, may be becoming drier, but at the same time, when you do have these thunderstorm events, precipitation is becoming more intense. And so there's a lot to do with that. And this is a really great graphic from John Gluck, our climate expert at the weather office that I work with. And he makes these graphics every month. And if you've seen them, there's a wealth of information on here. And I'd suggest taking a look at these every time they come out. We just had July's come out, which in fact, July was the hottest month on record. And it didn't just barely beat it, it shattered the record, becoming our hottest month on record. And that period of record for Tucson goes back for some time into the late 1800s. And looking at this, there's a couple things I really want to draw your attention to. The rare late June red flag warnings. This was the first time in Arizona that this late in June, a red flag warning has been issued since 1997. And in fact, for the Santa Catalina and Rincon Mountains that we kind of put those together for our red flag warnings for the higher elevations, it's never occurred this late in June. So that just shows you how abnormal and uncommon the weather event was. And looking at, so if you're looking at the graphics on the right side with the up and down bars, the blue basically means below average days, the red above average days. Those several below average days, while that was nice, that's just indicating that weather system coming down out of the Pacific Northwest, and that's what sparked what we call a dry thunderstorm. And then right after that, it was the worst case scenario. We got a dry thunderstorm, we got that fire, then we had very hot, very dry, very windy conditions for most of the month. And in fact, it was the windiest month on average at Tucson International Airport since 2004. And that's very representative of the area as well. And so all of that's really the comparison. And then one other comparison is looking at the monsoon, start times. And this is another graphic that John produced for us. And you can see here on the right side, those 4 dark brown areas, that's our late start of the monsoon over the past several years. And we thought last year was bad, and we completely have outdone it this year. We're well below average in precipitation, and this was one of the latest, not the latest, but almost the latest start of the monsoon. So when you have all these conditions, by the end of June, you're really, in the fire world, you're really saying, okay, here comes the moisture, here comes the better relative humidity at night, and here comes the rain. Well, it never came. And really, when we did get some, it just brought winds and gustier winds, and that created even more issues.
Let's take a moment and compare all the weather dynamics you describe about the record temperatures, and that sure felt like it, and just the dryness, the winds, etc. Let's compare fire to fire. Can we assume there was another big fire going on in Arizona, the bushfire burned something like 190,000 acres. Same factors feeding into that fire as the Bighorn Fire?
Yeah, absolutely. And that area, if everyone remembers back last fall, Hurricane Lorena, we had the remnants from Lorena, and those areas got significant precipitation and well above average. for that area. And again, it goes back to what some of the panelists have said. And we really had that that increased fine fuel loading, the grasses, and then the winds. And actually, we probably saw the lightest winds in Arizona. There's some of those weather systems, they didn't fully come all the way down into southern Arizona. So when you actually went north, you're going to have stronger influences from those winds. So they even saw windier and stronger wind events than what we've seen, and even stronger wind events across northern Arizona. And they had the same extreme heat. We've had a lot of excessive heat warnings and the very low relative humidity. And even at nighttime, when you usually expect to see some of those, what we call RH recoveries, we didn't really see a lot of that. There were some nights where the relative humidity, even in the mountains, stayed in the single digits and teens most, if not all, of the night.
Well, Jeremy, all we can ask you to do now is bring us some rain. And thank you once again for your time and your thoughts this evening. And please be on standby for some questions, because we're about to get rolling with questions that are being sent in by the folks who are joining us on this Zoom panel tonight. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Appreciate that insight. And we do have some questions, and some good ones, from those of you who've joined us this evening, and we thank you for that. And we'll start with a question for Dr. Kim Franklin from a viewer, if you will, in Tucson. At the end of the day, how do you describe how the buffle grass interacted with the fire? Did it happen from the get-go, Kim, when it hit an area that contained buffle grass? Was it a major factor in accelerating the fire? And what can we do about this buffle grass threat? Kim?
Well, I think that we can view this fire as a wake-up call. So we were really lucky that we didn't see more fire in the desert this time around. I don't know if we can pull up the map of the fire and the buffle grass that Aaron Olson, an image scientist working with the Desert Museum, recently mapped all of the buffle grass in the Catalinas. And if you look at that map, you see that there is a lot of buffle grass, but it exists in these discrete patches right now. And so if a patch is ignited, it's going to burn through that entire patch of buffle grass. But towards the edge of that patch, it's going to hit bare ground or rock. There'll be no fuel to carry it on to the next patch. But it's pretty reasonable to expect that these patches are going to continue to grow and coalesce into even an even bigger stand of fuel in the future. And so I think we have an opportunity now to save our saguaros, to save the desert ecosystem within the Catalinas and prevent it from becoming this buffle grass grassland.
Lots of work and lots of study ahead, yeah, to make that happen. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
We have a question from one of our viewers voicing concerns. We've heard this voice now. This is for CJ. And CJ, they're asking, might the fire have been deliberately routed through ecologically important habitats in order to save man-made structures in this case? Was that the strategy? Is that a strategy? And how do you balance the two concerns between homes and sensitive habitat like that in the heat of the moment?
Hey, so that's a great question. So what we do, or what was done, was based on some of the analysis that I was talking to you about in terms of potential control locations, and also making sure that we have to keep in mind our number one value, which is a value at risk, which are our firefighters on the ground. And so we have to make risk-based, prudent decisions in terms of how we're fighting this fire. And so based on what the incident management team was seeing and what we were seeing with this full suppression fire, the best strategy for us, the safest strategy for those firefighters and the highest what presented the highest probability of success was the strategy and tactics that were employed on this fire.
Is the Forest Service satisfied with the way things were channeled and how it all worked at the end of the day? Did the plan go as planned, more or less?
You know, Mike Tyson always says everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. I think in terms of this, the agency, I won't speak for the agency, I speak for myself. in us managing this fire. We were very, very satisfied with the fire, just because of, you know, those things that Steve hit on. This was a very large and complex incident. Several evacuations, it was 7 or 8 evacuations that we went through. So the logistics there to deal, and then also just very thankful to our cooperators as well, because they played a huge part in the success of this incident. You know, as Steve said, you know, 2 outbuildings damaged, no major injuries in this fire. So from our perspective in the big picture, it was a huge success in terms of being able to manage a wildfire of this size and of this complexity.
CJ, thank you. I'll ask you to keep standing by. I appreciate that. We have a question for Dr. Laura Marshall from Andy. Andy asked, Laura, can you talk more about the potential extent of oak replacing conifer species as predicted in the past by Don Falk and others in the Catalinas?
Yes, that's something that's a concern across many areas of the Southwest. I think in areas where you have a fire burned through a site and there's oak present on the site, it's just far more likely to get oak back rather than pines when you're in a hot, dry, you know, droughty weather period. So I think you can get pines back into that area. There's different studies going on. If you're planting into areas that have maybe a little bit more of moisture, like near a spring site, perhaps, and that can allow a little bit more potential, I guess, for maintaining pines. But generally, I think that's a major area of concern and something that's, you know, undergoing regular research here and elsewhere.
And a follow-up question from Abby, a concern about fire in a Sky Island situation. If essentially the entire Sky Island burns, what are the impacts on being able to recruit, if you will, new organisms, new life? Where will they come from? And how long will it take?
Yeah, it is really important to remember that fire is patchy. It's a mosaic. So not everywhere is completely torched, just patches. And in the patches that burn less severely, you do have surviving trees, surviving species that are able to recruit into the, you know, more severely burned areas. And I know ponderosa pine in general can move about 200 meters, I think, in a generation. So that's about as far as a seed will roll. So it takes 200 meters times however many generations of seeds to recover an area with pines. But that also requires weather conditions that will support the seedling growth, which, you know, you don't have as much say in.
Right. Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate it. You'll stand by for us too. We're going to go back to Dr. Kim Franklin now with a question. Doctor, more talk of buffle grass, it seems to be on the minds of many who are joining us this evening now. What else can we do is the upshot of the question. I know a lot of research to be had. There's a lot of effort already underway for this kind of thing, but what else can we do to control that buffalo grass?
Well, one thing that we can all do as individuals is make sure that there's no buffalo grass on your property, in your yard, and then even better in your neighborhood. Tell your friends and neighbors about this. And you can go to bufflegrass.org to learn a lot about it, how to identify it. And we are actually making a lot of progress in controlling buffalo grass in certain parts of the region. Saguaro National Park has been a leader in that and leading the way, showing us that it's possible to control it. So we can both manually remove it, dig it up, and also when there's these very large and accessible patches, herbicide is one way to control it. And those methods have been successful, and we're continuing to study them, monitor them, make sure that there's no collateral damage. So we're working on that research area.
Doctor, thanks. Yeah, it's nice to know everyone can play a part, you know, in their own small way toward the greater effort. So yeah, thank you. And please stand by. I want to direct a question to Dr. Molly Hunter now from CARA. When the different panels are speaking, Doctor, about fire severity, how is that defined as vegetation mortality, soil burn severity, fire intensity, or are there other metrics beyond that that you have?
Sure. So fire intensity is really just a measure of the actual heat put out by the fire. So that's measured kind of right as the fire is burning. And then in terms of fire severity, it's really a measure of the impact of the fire to the ecosystem. And there's two different ways of measuring it. I mean, of course, fire impacts multiple parts of the ecosystem, so you can think about it, that measure in a number of different ways. But usually what we're assessing first off in fire severity is the impact on the soil. That's what with the maps that have come out so far, that's what it's assessing. How much heat did the soil absorb, and were there any changes in that? Typically, over a longer period of time, you need time for vegetation to grow back at least for one season. And at that point, you'll do another assessment of severity, and it'll look at kind of the comparison of vegetation prior to the fire and after the fire. So that's another measure that'll give us some indication of the impact of the fire on the vegetation. So severity is kind of a general term that just looks at the impacts of the fire, and we have different ways of measuring it at different time intervals after the fire.
And as a follow-up, Molly, someone's asking about what are the environmental effects of the slurry on the vegetation and other aspects.
So the slurry is mostly a concern for aquatic systems. It's, the main component of it is fertilizer. So if you get some of that in waterways, it can, cause algal blooms and things like that, and have problems for aquatic species. But the Forest Service works very closely with the incident management team. There are areas mapped out ahead of the fire that the Forest Service says these are areas we need to avoid retardant because of, their sensitive aquatic areas or other areas they want to avoid. And so they work very closely to make sure that those impacts are really minimal.
Okay, thank you. And we'll have you stand by, Doctor. We appreciate that. People tend to ask about the price tag, and I'll direct this towards Steve. Steve, I hope you can answer this at least in a general sense, but how much did it cost to fight this fire, and how does it stack up against other wildfires? It certainly was drawn out, so more expensive, about in middle range. What can you tell us about that?
So the overall cost of suppressing the fire was about $40 million, which is a large amount of money. Actually, it was 44 million. The unfortunate side of that is that in recent years, we're starting to see more mega fires. So we're starting to see fires that are costing similar to this and even more. So it's something that we've become more familiar with.
And a follow-up, a couple of folks joining us say we noticed over the month-long effort that crew members and the sizes of the crews increased, of course, in proportion to the fire. We got up to that type 1 level we've spoken about. Why is this, and why was there not a huge force brought in immediately to suppress the fire in early June instead of bringing in air support and then waiting till later to throw more resources at it?
Sure. So at that point in time, there was already a type 1 incident going on nearby, which I believe was the Sawtooth Fire in the Tahoe National Forest. So they had drained a lot of resources at that point. And so when this particular fire started, the lightning storm that started this fire started a number of other fires within the zone. And so at that point, that first daytime operation, we were competing for resources all over southern Arizona, from the San Carlos Reservation to the Tahoe National Forest, state lands, Bureau of Land Management. So there was a draw on resources, and we only have a finite amount of resources. So what we did is we tapped into the national system. And did I freeze?
Talking about the gradual approach to adding resources to the fire and sort of stepping into it as the need dictated?
Sure. Actually, we were placing orders, but a lot of those orders being filled for firefighters were coming from far away. So they're not here, quickly. It takes them days to travel from Montana, the Northwest, Northern California. And so we were ramping up accordingly. and then also based on what we anticipated for the future. So we were definitely trying to ramp up resources as much as possible, and also trying to work through the competition with other fires and try and get those resources with us rather than the other incidents.
And type 1 is the top of the list, correct? We had a type 1. All the players seemed to change when we reached that critical level.
Sure. So we did go actually through 2 type 1 incident management teams. With a type 1 incident management team, they have a little bit more horsepower to be able to draw resources in because they get attention from the national level. And so that was another reason why we ordered a type 1 team.
Yeah, and a follow-up question for you or CJ, is there any reseeding done by the Forest Service, either from the air or the ground, or is it sort of let nature take its course in the areas that were burned?
And so, you know, there are several studies going on, and I know that's one of the big differences from the Aspen Fire. We did do some aerial seeding in the Aspen Fire, but we have not done any aerial seeding, and that was based on the recommendation from our burned area emergency response team. And so there is one little piece I wanted to add to what Steve was talking about in the first days of the fire. I hope people, because I did read one question about when firefighters actually arrived to it. So that night, was it June 5th? We had 2 starts that night. We had one on top of the mountain from that lightning bust that came through, and that was fully suppressed in the Spencer area. And then we had the Bighorn Fire that was started. And when I got the call at about 2200 that night from our duty officer who was on scene at the time, you know, we could not access that fire at night. It was not safe for firefighters to access that fire at night. So we did have firefighters on that fire from the time, basically within an hour or so of after it started.
Okay, yeah, I got after it pretty quickly, I remember, and then things grew from there, as they say. Thank you, CJ. Thank you, Steve. A question for Dr. Kim Franklin from Patrick Deal. In a recent webinar for Tucson Audubon, Professor Steve Smith brought up the role of red brome, an invasive grass, in providing fuel for the fire to feed on. How serious, Kim, is and was that threat as it pertains to the Bighorn Fire from red brome, it's called?
Yeah, red brome was very abundant this year. It followed 2 wet winters, and so there was a lot of red brome, especially over on the Catalina State Park side of the mountain. As to what extent it played in the fire, how much of it was burned, I can't say that at this point. We haven't been on the ground, but we do know that the fire started in an elevation that was most likely above Buffle Grass and in a grassland area. And so the grasses that may have been involved could be native grasses as well as other invasive grasses, not Buffle Grass, but red brome. And there's also layman's love grass, which is abundant in the Catalinas, and another problematic invasive grass.
Yeah, it's more work ahead with red brome, it sounds like, although not on the level of Buffle Grass, it sounds like. So,
No, a lot of the grasses that invade grassland ecosystems, they're not transforming one ecosystem, a desert, into a grassland. So their impact is a little bit less, I would say, than something like Buffle Grass.
okay, Doctor, thank you. We're going to jump back to Jeremy now, our meteorologist, Jeremy Michael, and ask, Linda wants to know approximately how long, Jeremy, does the soil remain hydrophobic after a fire like this? Can you help us with that one?
To a certain extent. I'm not a hydrologist, so it's not my area of expertise, but I know from a lot of the training that we also have to go through with the National Weather Service, the hydrophobic soils, and it really depends on fuel type, the severity of burns, but they can you can have impacts and increased runoff for several years, especially from high severity burns and timber. And then when you go down to some of the grasslands and things like that, it can recover a little bit more quickly, because if those grasslands, if you get rains and you get regrowth, that can help. So it's a little bit of a tricky question, and it can vary, and it all depends on the severity and as well as the time frame.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate that. back to CJ and Steve quickly. Either one of you, Dan wants to know, Dan Kimball is asking, any special firefighting practices that we're undertaking during the Bighorn undertaken to protect threatened or endangered species? Is there much you can do in a specific sense to protect saguaro or what have you? Or is it all just one big general effort out there?
No, we try and, like I had mentioned before, try and use the art and science. And so we try and implement low intensity burning on the landscape, you know. So we'll backfire down off of ridges. We'll utilize hand crews doing that. We'll also use helicopters to kind of backfire down. If it's going to be in there and we have fire down below it, then we'll backfire down to that main fire down below so that it's not a high intensity fire and we can maintain that overstory and that important habitat.
Okay, all right. And I know earlier you spoke about some of that. So that was the technique, if you will. Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think we're about to wrap things up, and I want to thank all of our panelists for their time and expertise. We would like to thank all of you for joining us. Before you go, please know that this is only the beginning, as the Chicago song goes. We have 2 more Zoom sessions with great panels. Next time to talk about the aftermath in episode 2. A week from tonight, same time, same place, we're going to talk about how the wildfire impacted the mountain's plants and the soil, and what to expect when more rains arrive. We've seen a little bit of that dynamic already. The vegetation, the upslope, research and insights into how fires affect sky islands, which we just brought up, in near time and far into the future. So we'll be covering that next week, same time, same place. I want to remind you this episode is being recorded and it will be posted in about a day. You'll be able to access it. And the recordings and registration for episode 2 are available at environment.arizona.edu/fireonthemountain. Again, environment.arizona.edu/fireonthemountain. And we hope you've enjoyed this evening's session. We do hope you'll enjoy next week's session and join us again. Thank you all so much for your time and your interest. And on behalf of everyone involved, good night.